I didn't think much of it at first. Just another quiet morning in a neighborhood that prides itself on being too clean, too controlled. The kind of place where people measure your grass with their eyes and smile while doing it. But then I saw the scratch. It ran across the driver's door of my truck like someone had taken their time, like they wanted me to feel it, not just see it. And that's when I knew this wasn't random. Someone wanted to send a message, and they picked the wrong guy to send it to. See, that truck wasn't just some old piece of metal sitting in a driveway. It was a 1968 Chevy C10, something I'd spent the better part of 3 years bringing back from the dead. I bought it off a guy 2 counties over, rusted frame, blown engine. Interior smelled like 10 years of regret, but I saw something in it. Every Saturday, every Sunday, sometimes late into the night after work, I was out there in my driveway with a socket wrench and a cheap radio, rebuilding it piece by piece. My neighbors would walk their dogs past me. Some would nod. Some would just stare like I was breaking some unspoken rule by getting my hands dirty in a place where most people hire everything out. There was this one guy, though, Harold Whitaker, HOA president, late 60s, always dressed like he had somewhere more important to be, even when he didn't, pressed polos, loafers, that kind of thing. He'd slow down when he walked past my place. Look at the truck, then look at me like I was the problem, not the rusted engine sitting on a stand. One time he actually stopped and said, "You planning on finishing that anytime soon? It's becoming visually disruptive." I just smiled, wiped my hands on a rag, and said, "Give me time, Harold, good things take a minute." He didn't like that. You could tell. Fast forward 3 years, the truck was finally done. Deep midnight blue paint, chrome shining like it belonged in a showroom, engine purring like it knew it had been given a second life. I parked it in my driveway that night and just stood there for a while, like you do when something actually turns out better than you imagined. For once, I felt like I belonged there, like I'd earned my spot in that neighborhood. And then the next morning happened. That scratch, 6 inches, maybe more, cut clean across the driver's door. Not jagged, not accidental, slow, deliberate, almost careful. Whoever did it wanted to make sure I saw it the second I stepped outside. And right under my windshield wiper, a notice. Violation of community aesthetic standards. Vehicle deemed inconsistent with neighborhood guidelines. 48 hours to remove or subject to $200 fine. No mention of the damage. No apology. Just a fine. I remember standing there, reading it twice, then a third time. Like maybe the words would rearrange themselves into something that made sense. But they didn't. So I did what anyone would do. I called the number at the bottom. Harold picked up. Of course he did. I said, "Hey, I got this notice, but my truck's parked in my own driveway, fully restored, registered, insured. Can you tell me what rule I'm breaking?" There was a pause on the other end. Then that same voice, calm, rehearsed, like he'd said it 100 times before. "The board has discretion in matters of aesthetic consistency." I let that sit for a second. "So, no rule number? Rules are guidelines," he said. "Compliance is expected regardless." I actually laughed at that, not because it was funny, but because it was so absurd I didn't know what else to do. "And the scratch?" I asked. "You guys gonna address that?" Another pause. Longer this time. "That is not an HOA matter." Then he hung up. 2 weeks later, another notice showed up. $175 this time. No explanation, no rule cited, just a balance due and a warning about further action. By then I'd already started looking into things, not officially, just paying attention, talking to neighbors. Turns out I wasn't the only one getting these vague fines, just the only one pushing back. Most people paid and moved on. That's how systems like that stay in place. Nobody wants the hassle. But here's the thing about me. I've never been great at letting things go when they don't make sense. And this didn't make sense on a lot of levels. A week after that second notice, I got a letter that changed the tone completely. Final warning before lien proceedings. Total balance, $525. 31 days. For parking a legally owned vehicle on my own property. I sat at my kitchen table staring at that number. Not because I couldn't pay it, but because I knew if I did, it wouldn't stop there. People like Harold don't back off. They escalate until you either fold or fight. And that's when something clicked. Because what Harold didn't know, what nobody in that neighborhood really knew, was that before I ever picked up a wrench, before I spent weekends restoring old trucks, I spent 12 years working insurance claims. Not the desk kind either, The kind where you show up after something's gone wrong and figure out what actually happened. Reading damage patterns, pulling footage, following money trails, it's second nature to me. So I looked back out at my truck, at that clean, deliberate scratch, and I stopped thinking about it as vandalism. I started thinking about it as evidence. And once you start looking at something that way, you don't stop until you find the truth. Once I started looking at it that way, everything shifted. The scratch wasn't just damage anymore. It was a timeline, a decision, a moment someone thought they'd get away with something because no one would push back. And maybe they were right, just not this time. I didn't rush into anything, though. That's the mistake people make when they get angry. They move too fast. They tip their hand. I learned a long time ago that if you're going to pull on a thread, you better be ready to see where it leads. So I slowed down, took a breath, and started with the basics. First thing I did was walk the perimeter of my driveway like I was back on a claim site, checking angles, lines of sight, where someone would stand if they wanted to stay out of view. That's when I remembered Mrs. Alvarez across the street. Sweet lady, always baking something. And more importantly, she had one of those doorbell cameras her grandson installed. I'd helped her carry groceries once or twice, so when I knocked, she opened the door with that same warm smile and said, "You finally finished that beautiful truck. What happened to it?" I just nodded toward the scratch and said, "I was hoping your camera might have caught something." She didn't hesitate. "Come in." We sat in her living room, curtains half drawn, the glow of that little screen lighting up her face as she pulled up the footage. We didn't know the exact time, so we started scrubbing through the evening before. Cars passing, people walking dogs, nothing unusual. 10 minutes went by, then 20, and I was starting to think whoever did it knew exactly where not to be seen. And then, 9:52 p.m., a figure walked into frame from the right side of the street. Slow, steady, not looking around, not rushing, just moving like they belonged there. Even before the camera caught his face, I knew. There's a certain way people carry themselves when they think they're in control, shoulders back, head slightly tilted, like the world is something they manage, not something they're part of. "Harold." Mrs. Alvarez leaned forward. "Is that?" "Yeah," I said, already feeling that quiet kind of anger settle in, the kind that doesn't explode, it just focuses. We watched as he stopped right in front of my driveway. No hesitation. He reached into his pocket, pulled something out, keys. And then, in one slow, uninterrupted motion, he dragged it across my door panel. Not quick, not sloppy deliberate. Like he wanted to make sure it left a mark that couldn't be ignored. Mrs. Alvarez covered her mouth. "Oh my God." I didn't say anything. I just watched it again. And again. Not because I needed confirmation, but because I wanted to understand the intent. That's the thing about footage. It doesn't just show you what happened, it shows you how someone thinks. And Harold? He wasn't reacting. He was making a statement. I thanked her, asked if she could send me the clip, and she said, "Of course, and honey, don't let him push you around." I smiled, but in my head, I was already 3 steps ahead. Because now I had something real, but it still wasn't enough. Not yet. See, proving he scratched my truck was one thing, but I had a feeling this wasn't just about a truck. People don't take risks like that unless they feel protected, unless they think the system around them is solid enough to absorb it. And Harold had been running that HOA for years, unchecked, unchallenged. That kind of confidence usually comes from somewhere deeper. So I filed a formal records request with the HOA management company. Nothing aggressive, just standard language, requesting financial disclosures, vendor contracts, meeting minutes. The kind of request they can't legally ignore, but definitely don't enjoy fulfilling. A week went by. No response. I followed up. Polite, but firm. Mentioned timelines, compliance requirements. You'd be surprised how quickly people start paying attention when they realize you know the rules better than they do. 2 days later, I got a call. "This is Denise from Evergreen Property Management. We received your request." Her tone was careful, like she was trying to figure out what I was really after. "I appreciate that," I said. "Just looking for transparency." She paused. "That's a lot of documents." "I've got time." Another pause. "Then, we'll send what we can." What I got back 3 days later was more than enough. I spread everything out on my dining table like I used to with case files, invoices, contracts, payment logs. At first glance, it looked routine, landscaping, maintenance, seasonal work. But patterns start to show when you stop looking at things individually and start connecting them. Over 22 months, $38,000 in landscaping contracts. Every single one awarded to the same vendor. No competitive bids. No alternate quotes. Just approval after approval, signed off by the board, chaired by Harold. That alone was questionable, but not illegal. Not yet. So I dug deeper. Cross-referenced the vendor's address with property records. Took maybe 10 minutes. And there it was. The address matched a residential property owned by someone named Daniel Whitaker. Same last name. I leaned back in my chair, let that sit for a second, then pulled up public records, confirmed the relationship. Brother-in-law. Now it was starting to make sense. This wasn't about my truck being visually disruptive. This was about control. About someone who'd gotten comfortable bending the rules just enough to benefit from them, and making sure no one challenged that balance. My truck? It stood out. It didn't fit his version of the neighborhood, and more importantly, I didn't play along. So he pushed, first with notices, then with fines. And when that didn't work, he escalated. The scratch wasn't random. It was pressure. I remember sitting there, looking at those documents, the footage queued up on my laptop, and feeling something shift again. Not anger this time, clarity. Because now I wasn't just dealing with a petty HOA president. I was looking at someone who'd crossed a line, more than one. But here's the thing, evidence only matters if you use it the right way. You don't just dump it out and hope people care. You present it at the right time, in the right setting, where it can't be ignored or brushed aside. And I knew exactly where that needed to happen. The next HOA membership meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday. Open attendance. 60-plus homeowners, give or take. Most of them show up out of habit, some out of curiosity, a few because they actually care. Harold usually ran those meetings like a script, controlled, efficient, no room for deviation. But that night was going to be different. I spent the next couple days organizing everything, trimming the footage to the exact moment, printing out the financial records, highlighting the patterns, but not overdoing it. You don't want to look like you're trying too hard. The truth carries more weight when it feels obvious. Thursday came quicker than I expected. I walked into that meeting with a folder under my arm and my laptop in a bag. Nothing flashy, nothing dramatic. Just prepared. People nodded as I took a seat. A couple neighbors asked about the truck. I just said, working on it. At the front of the room, Harold was already in position, same posture, same calm authority, like nothing had changed. Like he hadn't stood in front of my house 3 nights ago and dragged a key across something I'd spent years building. He glanced at me once, just a flicker, then moved on with the agenda. And I let him, because timing is everything. He got about halfway through the agenda before I stood up, not abruptly, not in a way that made a scene, just enough to shift the room a little. You could feel it, that subtle change when people realize something unscripted is about to happen. Harold looked up, gave me that tight, polite smile he used when he thought he was still in control. We'll have a Q&A at the end, he said, already trying to move past me. I won't need long. I replied, calm, steady. That got a few heads turning. People leaned back in their chairs, some crossed their arms, others just watched, because whether they admitted it or not, most of them had felt the same pressure at some point. They just never pushed back. Harold hesitated, just for a second, then gestured like he was granting permission. Go ahead. I walked to the front, set my laptop on the table, didn't say a word at first. That silence, it matters. It pulls people in, makes them pay attention. Then I turned the screen so it faced the room and hit play. No introduction, no explanation, just the footage. Grainy doorbell video, timestamp in the corner. 9:52 p.m. A figure entering frame, walking with purpose, stopping in front of my driveway. A few people leaned forward, squinting. Then the angle shifted just enough to catch his face. You could hear it, that low ripple through the room. Not loud, not chaotic, just recognition spreading from one person to the next. And then came the moment. The key in his hand, the slow, deliberate motion across my truck's door. No rush, no hesitation, just a clean, intentional line. Someone in the back muttered, "No way." I let the clip run its full length, then stopped it right there, frozen on that frame. I didn't look at Harold. Not yet. I turned back to the table, opened the folder, and laid out the documents one by one. Over the past 22 months, I said, finally breaking the silence, this HOA has approved $38,000 in landscaping contracts, all awarded to the same vendor. I slid the first page forward, then the next, then the next. No competitive bids, no alternate quotes, just repeat approvals. I could feel the room tightening, people shifting in their seats, looking at the papers, then at each other. That's the thing about numbers, they don't argue. They just sit there until someone decides to acknowledge them. And that vendor, I continued, tapping the top sheet lightly, is registered to a residential address, owned by Daniel Whitaker. Now I looked up. Your brother-in-law. That's when Harold stood up. Fast. Chair scraping against the floor. This is completely inappropriate, he snapped, voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. These documents are being taken out of context, and that footage is unedited, I said, cutting in, still calm. Pulled directly from a third-party device. Timestamped. You're welcome to verify it. He pointed at the screen, shaking his head. This is manipulation. You're trying to discredit. But he didn't get to finish. One of the board members, a woman named Karen who'd barely spoken in any meeting I'd ever attended, raised her hand slightly. Harold, is that you in the video? Simple question. No accusation. Just direct. He hesitated. And that hesitation said more than anything else could have. Another board member leaned forward, elbows on the table. And the vendor, is that your family? The room was quiet now. Not tense, just focused. Like everyone had finally stopped pretending they didn't see what was right in front of them. Harold opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. This is being blown out of proportion. The board has always acted in the best interest of the community. Karen shook her head, slow, disappointed. You need to step down. That landed harder than anything I could have said, because it didn't come from me. It came from inside his own circle. Within minutes, the meeting was no longer his. People started talking, asking questions, looking at documents, replaying the clip. The control he'd held for years, it didn't shatter all at once. It just slipped, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to hold on to. I didn't stay much longer. I didn't need to. By the time I walked out of that room, I already knew how it was going to end. 10 days later, Harold Whitaker resigned. No announcement, no speech, just an email sent to the board, short and clinical. The kind of message you write when there's nothing left to defend. A week after that, the HOA's insurance carrier opened a formal investigation into the contracts. Turns out, when money and family start mixing without documentation, people get interested fast. Every fine against me, voided, wiped clean like they were never there. But I wasn't done. The same afternoon his resignation hit the board's inbox, my attorney filed a civil claim, property damage, harassment, abuse of authority. Not because I needed the money, but because some lines, once crossed, deserve more than just a quiet exit. And then came Sunday. Now, here's where it gets interesting. See, during those 3 years I spent restoring that truck, I got to know a few people. Local guys, weekend builders, folks who understood what it means to bring something back to life with your own hands. We weren't a formal club or anything, just a loose network of people who shared the same kind of obsession. Word travels fast in circles like that. So when everything went down, when the story started making its way through phone calls and group chats, someone had an idea. Let's take a drive out your way next Sunday. I didn't ask how many. I just said, as long as we follow the rules. Sunday morning rolled in quiet, same as always. Birds, sprinklers, the low hum of a neighborhood that hadn't quite processed what had just happened. Then, around 9 a.m., you could hear it. Engines. Not loud, not aggressive, just a steady, growing presence. One by one, they rolled in vintage Mustangs, old Chevelles, a couple of Fords that looked like they'd been polished more than driven, 58 cars in total by the time it settled. And every single one of them, parked in perfect compliance. Driveways were allowed. Street parking within marked limits. No blocked sidewalks, no violations, no technicalities to hide behind. Just cars. Beautiful, restored, undeniable. Hoods went up. Lawn chairs came out. People started talking, not arguing, not complaining, just existing in a way that, for once, didn't feel controlled. I stood there next to my truck, the scratch still faintly visible under the new light, and watched as neighbors walked out of their houses, some curious, some confused, some quietly smiling. Because here's the thing. Rules don't mean much until everyone understands them the same way. And for a long time, those rules had only worked in one direction, until someone decided to read them closely. Harold used to say, compliance is expected regardless. Turns out, he was right, just not in the way he thought. So now I'm curious, if you were in that room, watching that footage play out, seeing those numbers laid on the table, would you have spoken up sooner, or would you have stayed quiet like most people do? And when rules start getting used as weapons instead of guidelines, where do you draw the line between order and control? Let me know what you think, because stories like this, they don't just happen in one neighborhood.